My name is Watson, and I live in a small, quiet town where everyone knows each other. I enjoy hosting dinner parties at my house and bringing friends together for good food and conversation. It was a warm summer evening when I decided to host another dinner party, inviting my closest friends. I had no idea that this night would turn into a mystery that still haunts me. I spent the entire day preparing for the party. The table was set with my best dishes, and the house smelled of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow through the windows as my friends started to arrive. Sarah, Mark, Lisa, and John were all there, along with a new friend, Tom, who had recently moved to town. Tom was a bit of a mystery. He was quiet and reserved, but I thought it would be nice to include him in our group. He seemed happy to be invited, and I hoped he would enjoy the evening with us. We all gathered around the table, laughing and sharing stories as we ate. The dinner went smoothly, with everyone enjoying the food and each other's company. After dessert, we moved to the living room to continue our conversation. Tom was unusually quiet, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he was just shy, or perhaps he didn't feel comfortable yet. As the evening progressed, Tom's mood seemed to shift. He became tense and irritable, barely speaking and avoiding eye contact. I noticed, but I didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable by asking in front of everyone. Eventually, he stood up abruptly, muttering something about needing to leave. Before I could say anything, he was out the door, slamming it behind him. We all sat in stunned silence, unsure of what had just happened. After a few moments, we tried to brush it off and continued the evening, though the mood had shifted. The night eventually came to an end, and my friends said their goodbyes. Still puzzled by Tom's sudden departure, the next day I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check on Tom, hoping to find out what had upset him. I went to his house, but there was no answer when I knocked. His car was in the driveway, but it seemed as if no one was home. I left, thinking he might just need some space. A few days passed, and I still hadn't heard from Tom. I reached out to my friends, but no one had seen or heard from him either. Concerned, I decided to call the police and report him missing. They took my statement and assured me they would look into it. Weeks turned into months, and there was still no sign of Tom. The police had searched his house, talked to neighbors, and followed every lead, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. My friends and I were left with more questions than answers. One evening, I found myself going through the events of that night over and over in my mind. What had caused Tom to leave so suddenly? I couldn't help but feel responsible, wondering if I had missed some sign or if there was something I could have done to prevent it. Determined to find some answers, I started looking into Tom's past. I learned that he had moved to our town after a difficult breakup and was looking for a fresh start. He didn't have many friends, and his family lived far away. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I knew about him. One night, while I was alone in my house, I heard a noise outside. It was a faint rustling, like someone was moving through the bushes. My heart raced as I peered out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The noise stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. The following nights, the noises continued. Footsteps, whispers, and the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. My sleep was disturbed, and I felt on edge all the time. One evening, I found an old journal in Tom's house that the police had overlooked. It was filled with his thoughts and feelings, revealing a troubled mind. He wrote about feeling out of place, not just in our town but in life. The entries grew darker, filled with paranoia and fear. The last entry was dated the night of the dinner party. It read, "I can't escape it. It's always watching, always waiting. I need to leave before it's too late." Reading those words sent a chill down my spine. What had Tom been so afraid of? I shared the journal with the police, but it didn't provide any concrete answers. They continued their investigation. The trail had gone cold. As time passed, the memory of that night faded for everyone, except me. I couldn't let it go. Haunted by the unknown, I often found myself staring out into the darkness, listening for those faint noises, wondering if Tom was out there somewhere. Lost and scared, my friends tried to comfort me, but the mystery remained unsolved. Tom was gone, We might never know what happened to him. The dinner party that had ended happily for the rest of us had left a shadow over my life. A reminder that sometimes the most ordinary moments can turn into the most inexplicable mysteries. In the quiet moments when I'm alone with my thoughts, I still think of Tom on that fateful night. The unanswered questions linger, a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest, and so I continue to search for answers, hoping that one day the mystery will be solved and Tom's story will finally have an ending. A few years ago, my son Alex was brought home late one night by his friend James. Alex was 20 at the time and had been out with friends. I was already in bed when I heard the front door open. I quickly got up to check what was happening. I saw James struggling to hold Alex up as I reached the living room. Alex was very drunk, barely able to stand on his own. Clothes were disheveled, and his eyes were half closed. James was a tall, muscular young man who seemed to handle Alex's weight easily. "Sorry about this," James said, his voice steady. "Alex had a bit too much to drink." I nodded, my concern for my son overshadowing any frustration I might have felt. "Let's get him to his room," I said, moving to help. Together, we managed to get Alex up the stairs and into his bed. He mumbled incoherently, head lolling to the side. I pulled off his shoes and tucked him in, hoping he would sleep it off, feel better in the morning. James watched for a moment before turning to leave. "Thanks for bringing him home," I said, feeling more relieved now that Alex was safe. "No problem," James replied with a small smile. "I'll check on him tomorrow." With that, James left, and I went back to my room, hoping for some sleep. The next day, Alex was groggy but otherwise fine. He didn't remember much from the previous night, just that he had been out with friends and had too much to drink. Life went on as usual, and I didn't think much more about that night. A year later, everything changed. One evening, I was watching the news when a breaking story caught my attention. The reporter was standing in front of a hotel, describing a horrific crime that had taken place. My heart sank as I listened. "A young man was found dead in his hotel room earlier today," the reporter said. "The victim, whose name has not been released, was reportedly checked into the hotel by a friend the previous night. Police are now searching for the friend, who is considered a suspect." I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the story seemed disturbingly familiar. I watched, horrified, as the reporter continued. "According to witnesses, the suspect was seen leaving the hotel early this morning. Police have released this sketch of the suspect." The screen showed a drawing of a man who looked eerily like James. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. Could it be him? The thought was almost too much to bear. I immediately called Alex. He answered on the third ring, his voice sleepy. "Alex, turn on the news," I said urgently. "There's something you need to see." A few minutes later he called back, his voice now fully awake and filled with shock. "What do we do?" "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. "We need to call the police." We did just that, and soon detectives were at our house, asking questions about James. Alex told them everything he knew about the night James brought him home drunk and how they had been friends for years. The detectives took notes, their faces serious. Days turned into weeks as the search for James continued. The story was all over the news, and everyone in our small town was talking about it. The more I learned, the more horrified I became. James had not only gotten his friend drunk, but he had also checked them into the hotel, only to kill them and escape. The brutality of the crime was unimaginable. Alex was deeply affected by the news. He couldn't believe that his friend, someone he had trusted, could do something so terrible. He became withdrawn, spending most of his time in his room. I tried to comfort him, but there were no words that could make the situation better. One night, a few weeks after the news broke, Alex and I were sitting in the living room. The house was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Alex was staring at the floor, lost in thought. "Mom," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Do you think I could have been next?" Question hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. I didn't know what to say. The thought had crossed my mind too many times, and it was something I tried to push away. "I don't know, Alex," I said softly, "but you're safe now, and that's what matters." The police eventually found James. He had fled to a neighboring state and was hiding out in a rundown motel. His capture brought some relief. The scars he left behind were deep. The trial was long and painful, with details of the crime coming to light that were almost too much to bear. In the end, James was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But for Alex and me, life would never be the same. The fear and betrayal we felt lingered, casting a shadow over our days. Alex struggled to move on, haunted by the knowledge that someone he had considered a friend was capable of such evil. Years have passed since then. The memories remain. Alex has tried to rebuild his life, but there are moments when I see the pain in his eyes, a reminder of the nightmare we lived through. The experience taught us both a hard lesson about trust and the darkness that can hide within people we think we know. We still talk about that night sometimes. The night James brought Alex home serves as a stark reminder of how close we came to losing everything. And though we've tried to move forward, the shadows of that time are never far behind. Last September, my friends and I decided to go for a night drive. We were bored and wanted an adventure. It was a cold, clear night, and the moonlight made the empty roads look mysterious. There were 4 of us in the car: me, Alex, Sam, and Jenny. We drove aimlessly, laughing and playing music, but soon the conversation turned to ghost stories. Someone mentioned an old, abandoned house at the edge of town. "We should go there," Sam suggested with a grin. The idea was thrilling and scary at the same time. We all agreed, and Alex, who was driving, turned the car in the direction of the house. The roads became narrower and bumpier as we got closer. Tall trees lined the path, their branches looking like twisted fingers in the moonlight. Finally, we saw it, the old abandoned house. It stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by overgrown bushes and tall grass. The house was large, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked like it had been empty for years. The car's headlights cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the house look even scarier. We parked the car a little way down the road, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves. As we walked towards the house, the air felt colder, and I could hear the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel. My heart was beating fast, and I could tell my friends were nervous too. We reached the front door, which was hanging off its hinges. Alex pushed it open with a creak, and we stepped inside. The air inside was musty and stale. The moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows on the dusty floor. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. We split up to explore. Jenny and I went upstairs, while Alex and Sam stayed on the ground floor. The stairs groaned under our weight as we climbed. Each step echoed through the empty house. Upstairs, we found old furniture covered in white sheets, broken picture frames, and cobwebs in every corner. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jenny and I moved from room to room, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. In one of the rooms, I found an old diary on a dusty table. I picked it up and opened it, but the pages were too faded to read. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from downstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. "Alex, Sam, Jenny," I called out, but there was no answer. We hurried back down the stairs. The living room was empty, but the front door was now closed. We hadn't heard it shut. A sense of dread washed over me. Something wasn't right. "Let's find them and get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We moved through the house, checking each room. The kitchen was empty, and so was the dining room. As we entered the last room, a small storage space at the back of the house, we found Alex and Sam. Last September, my friends and I decided to go for a night drive. We were bored and wanted an adventure. It was a cold, clear night, and the moonlight made the empty roads look mysterious. There were 4 of us in the car: me, Alex, Sam, and Jenny. We drove aimlessly, laughing and playing music. Soon the conversation turned to ghost stories. Someone mentioned an old abandoned house at the edge of town. "We should go there," Sam suggested with a grin. The idea was thrilling and scary at the same time. We all agreed, and Alex, who was driving, turned the car in the direction of the house. The roads became narrower and bumpier as we got closer. Tall trees lined the path, their branches looking like twisted fingers in the moonlight. Finally, we saw it. The old abandoned house. It stood at the end of a long gravel driveway. surrounded by overgrown bushes and tall grass. The house was large, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked like it had been empty for years. The car's headlights cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the house look even scarier. We parked the car a little way down the road, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves. As we walked towards the house, the air felt colder, and I could hear the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel. My heart was beating fast, and I could tell my friends were nervous too. We reached the front door, which was hanging off its hinges. Alex pushed it open with a creak, and we stepped inside. The air inside was musty and stale. The moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows on the dusty floor. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. We split up to explore. Jenny and I went upstairs, while Alex and Sam stayed on the ground floor. The stairs groaned under our weight as we climbed. Each step echoed through the empty house. Upstairs, we found old furniture covered in white sheets, broken picture frames, and cobwebs in every corner. Felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jenny and I moved from room to room, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. In one of the rooms, I found an old diary on a dusty table. I picked it up and opened it. Pages were too faded to read. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from downstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. "Alex, Sam, Jenny." I called out, but there was no answer. We hurried back down the stairs. The living room was empty, but the front door was now closed. We hadn't heard it shut. A sense of dread washed over me. Something wasn't right. "Let's find them and get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We moved through the house, checking each room. Kitchen was empty, and so was the dining room. As we entered the last room, a small storage space at the back of the house, we found Alex and Sam. They were standing still, staring at something on the floor. I followed their gaze and saw what they were looking at. Trapdoor. "Did you open it?" I asked. Sam shook his head. It was already open when we got here." A cold draft came up from the trapdoor, sending shivers down my spine. The darkness below seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. Against my better judgment, we decided to go down the narrow wooden ladder. Creaked as we descended into the basement. The basement was damp and cold. The walls were lined with shelves full of dusty jars and old tools. In the corner, there was a small flickering light. We cautiously approached it and found an old lantern hanging from a nail in the wall. Cast a dim glow, barely illuminating the room. Suddenly we heard footsteps above us. Someone else was in the house. My heart pounded in my chest. We turned off our flashlights and stood still, listening. Footsteps grew louder, coming closer to the trapdoor. We held our breath, hoping whoever it was would leave. The footsteps stopped right above us. Then, slowly, the trapdoor began to creak open. A figure appeared at the top of the ladder, silhouetted against the dim light from the living room. It was a man, tall and thin, with wild hair and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. Climbed down the ladder and we backed away, trying to stay out of his sight. The man moved slowly, methodically, as if he was searching for something. He muttered to himself, words we couldn't understand. I could feel my friends trembling beside me. We needed to get out of there, but the only way was past the man. Suddenly, the man stopped and turned his head, looking directly at us. His eyes locked onto mine, and a cold smile spread across his face. He started walking towards us, and panic set in. We bolted for the ladder, scrambling up as fast as we could. Alex went first, followed by Jenny, then me, and finally Sam. As we reached the top, the man grabbed Sam's ankle, pulling him back down. Sam kicked and struggled, and we all grabbed him, pulling him with all our strength. Sam managed to break free, and we slammed the trapdoor shut, locking it with a rusty bolt. We didn't stop to catch our breath. We ran out of the house, through the front door, and back to the car. We jumped in, and Alex started the engine. The tires screeched as we sped away, not looking back. As we drove away, the house disappeared into the darkness behind us. We didn't speak, too shaken by what had just happened. The thrill of the night drive had turned into a nightmare. We had found our adventure, but it was one we would never want to repeat. From that night on, we never spoke of the abandoned house again. The memory of the man and his eerie smile haunted me for weeks. Even now, when I drive past the edge of town, I feel a chill and speed up, not wanting to be reminded of that terrifying night. I worked the night shift at a quiet gas station in New Hampshire. The job was simple. My duties included stocking shelves, cleaning, and handling the register. The nights were usually calm, with only a few customers stopping by to fill up their tanks or grab a snack. One night, as I was preparing to close up, I noticed the air felt different. There was a strange stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. As the clock neared midnight, an old car pulled up to the pump. Out stepped an elderly man wearing khakis and a button-down shirt. His white hair was neatly combed, and he moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He walked into the store, and I greeted him with a smile. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" I asked. He nodded politely and walked around the store, browsing the shelves. I went back to my tasks, wiping down the counter and straightening the magazines. After a few minutes, he approached the counter with a small bottle of water and a pack of gum. "Will that be all?" I asked, ringing up his items. He nodded again, his eyes fixed on mine. Something was unsettling about his gaze, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As I handed him his change, he reached out and gripped my wrist. His touch was cold, and I felt a shiver run through me. "Hell is a real place," he said in a low, gravelly voice, "and the devil has already got his hand on you, girl. Be careful." I froze, staring at him in shock. His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. He released my wrist, took his items, and walked out of the store without another word. I watched him drive away, the taillights of his car disappearing into the darkness. For a moment, I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. His words echoed in my mind, sending chills down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to my work. The unease lingered. I finished my shift and locked up the store, but I couldn't stop thinking about the old man. His warning played over and over in my head, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What did he mean? Why did he say that to me? As I drove home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the old man's car following me. The night seemed darker than usual, and every shadow felt menacing. When I finally reached my apartment, I quickly locked the door behind me and checked all the windows. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak and groan of the building made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The old man's warning haunted my dreams, and I woke up several times in a cold sweat. The next day, I told my coworker about the encounter. He laughed it off, saying the old man was probably just crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. I felt a heavy weight on my chest, as if a dark cloud was hanging over me. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of the old man's warning started to fade. Life went on as usual, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease every time I worked the night shift. One night, as I was restocking the shelves, I heard a faint whisper. I turned around, but there was no one there. I shrugged it off as my imagination and went back to work, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all around me. I couldn't make out the words. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of dread grew stronger. I felt a chill in the air, and my heart started to race. I looked around the store, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The lights flickered for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. My breath came in short gasps, and I felt a surge of panic. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with their insistent murmur. I ran to the front of the store and grabbed my phone, dialing my coworker's number with trembling fingers. The phone rang and rang. There was no answer. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. The memory of the old man's warning came rushing back. I felt a sense of terror grip my heart. Just then, the door chime rang, and I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was the old man, his eyes fixed on mine. He walked slowly towards me, his footsteps echoing in the empty store. "Hell is a real place," he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. "And the devil has already got his hand on you, girl. Be careful." I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The old man's gaze was intense, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. He reached out and touched my wrist. His grip was cold and unyielding. "Be careful," he repeated, voice a whisper. I felt a surge of panic and pulled away. stumbling backward. The old man's eyes seemed to bore into my soul, and I felt a sense of impending doom. I turned and ran out of the store, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove home in a daze, the old man's warning echoing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I felt a heavy weight on my chest. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed on the couch, my heart racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The old man's words haunted me, and I felt a sense of terror I couldn't explain. The next day, I called in sick and stayed home, too afraid to go back to work. I never saw the old man again, but his warnings stayed with me. The memory of that night still sends chills down my spine, and I can't shake the feeling something dark is watching me. I don't know if the old man was crazy or if his warning was real, but I'll never forget the fear I felt that night. Gas station. My name is John, and I enjoy taking my family on little adventures. We live in the city, so sometimes we like to escape to the countryside. One summer, I rented an old farmhouse on Airbnb. It looked perfect. Big yard, old charm, and even a pool. It was a great spot to relax and unwind for a weekend. We arrived on a sunny Friday afternoon. My wife, Julian, and our 2 kids, Liam and Zoe, were excited. The farmhouse stood at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by trees. It had a wide porch with creaky wooden steps, and the inside was full of antique furniture and old pictures. It felt like stepping back in time. After unpacking, we decided to spend the evening by the pool. The kids splashed around while Julian and I sat on the edge, dipping our feet in the cool water. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the kids' laughter and the gentle rustling of leaves. As night fell, we set up some lights around the pool and had dinner outside. The stars were bright and everything seemed perfect. But then I heard it, a crunching sound like someone walking on dry leaves. I looked around, but it was dark beyond the reach of our lights. Julian noticed my concern. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "I'm sure it's just an animal," she replied, trying to sound calm, but the sounds continued and they seemed to be getting closer. I told the kids to get out of the pool and go inside. We gathered our things quickly, and I locked the door behind us. Inside, the house felt safe, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. Julian and I put the kids to bed, and I kept a flashlight in my phone nearby. Hours passed, and the house was quiet. Just as I started to relax, there was a loud knock at the door. My heart jumped. I grabbed the flashlight and looked through the peephole. A man stood outside, wearing a police uniform. "Open up, it's the police," he called out. I hesitated. Why would the police be here at this hour? I decided to call out through the door. "Why are you here?" I asked. "There's been a report of suspicious activity. Please open the door," he replied. Something didn't feel right. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. I decided to call the local police station to verify. As I dialed, the man outside knocked again, harder this time. "Open the door now," he shouted. The dispatcher at the police station answered, and I quickly explained the situation. They said they hadn't sent anyone to our location and advised me to stay inside and lock everything. They were sending real officers to our address. Fear gripped me. I told Julian to take the kids and hide in one of the bedrooms. I could hear the man outside trying the door handle. I went to the living room and turned off all the lights, peeking through the curtains. More figures were moving around outside. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. The knocking continued, and the man claimed to be the police, demanding we open the door. I knew he wasn't telling the truth. My phone buzzed. The real police were almost there. Suddenly, the fake officer started banging on the windows, trying to find a way in. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't break the glass. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car coming down the long driveway. The figures outside scattered into the woods. Real police officers arrived and checked the area. They found no sign of the imposters. They assured us we were safe, but suggested we find another place to stay for the night. They said it wasn't common, but sometimes people posed as officers to gain entry to homes. Their intentions were unknown, but it was clear they meant no good. We packed our bags and left the farmhouse, heading to a nearby hotel. The kids were scared but safe. Julian and I were shaken but relieved. As we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if we had opened the door. was a frightening experience that reminded me to always trust my instincts and verify before letting anyone in. We never found out who the fake police were or what they wanted, but we were thankful for the real officers who arrived just in time. That night changed the way I think about safety. And I'm more cautious now, especially when renting places in unfamiliar areas. Our little adventure turned into a night of terror, but we were lucky to come out of it unharmed. It was a lesson learned, and from then on, I made sure to always double-check everything and stay alert, no matter how safe a place seemed. In 2016, I had a strange experience that still haunts me. It was a Saturday night, and I was feeling exhausted after a long week of work. I decided to go to bed early, hoping to catch up on some much-needed sleep. My small apartment was quiet, with only the occasional hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. I crawled into bed around 9 p.m., pulling the covers up to my chin, closed my eyes, and soon drifted off into a deep sleep. My dreams were vivid, filled with strange and unsettling images, but I couldn't wake up. It felt like I was trapped in my sleep, unable to move or open my eyes. When I finally woke up, it was still dark outside. I reached for my phone on the nightstand to check the time. It was 3:33 a.m. I groggily sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes. As I looked around the room, I noticed something that made my heart race. There was another bed in my room, right next to mine. I was sure it wasn't there when I went to sleep. My apartment was small, just a one-bedroom unit, and there was no space for an extra bed. I blinked several times, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the bed was still there. It was identical to mine, with white sheets and a dark wooden frame. But what terrified me was the figure lying in the bed. Someone was under the white sheet, completely still. The sheet was pulled up over their head, so I couldn't see their face. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I stared at the figure. Who could it be? No one else had keys to my apartment. I hadn't invited anyone over. I wanted to scream, but my voice seemed stuck in my throat. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. Should I call the police? I quietly got out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. My heart pounded in my chest as I tiptoed to the door. I reached for the light switch, but my hand trembled so much that I missed it the first time. When I finally turned on the light, the figure didn't move. The room was now brightly lit. I could see the sheet, looked old and worn, with small stains on it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I slowly walked over to the bed, my eyes never leaving the figure. As I got closer, I could see that the sheet was thin, almost transparent. I could make out the shape of the person's body underneath, but their face was still hidden. My hand shook as I reached out to touch the sheet. Just as my fingers brushed against the fabric, the figure moved. It jumped back, my heart racing. The figure sat up slowly, the sheet still covering them. They turned their head towards me, and I could feel their eyes on me even though I couldn't see them. I was frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. The figure stood up, still wrapped in the sheet. They were tall, taller than anyone I knew. They took a step towards me, and I finally found my voice. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there silently, watching me. I backed away, my mind racing with fear. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran towards the door, my hands fumbling with the lock. I could hear the figure's footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I finally managed to unlock the door and ran out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, cool night air hitting my face. I leaned against the building, trying to catch my breath. My mind was spinning with questions. Who was that? How did they get into my apartment? I knew I couldn't go back in there alone, so I called the police. When the officers arrived, I explained what had happened. They looked at me with concern and asked me to wait outside while they checked the apartment. I paced back and forth, my heart still racing. After what felt like an eternity, the officers came back out. "There's no one in there," one of them said. "We checked every room. Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" I knew what I had seen, but I didn't argue. I thanked the officers and watched as they drove away. I stood there for a long time, staring up at my apartment window. Finally, I gathered the courage to go back inside. The extra bed was gone, and there was no sign of the figure. Everything was exactly as it had been before I went to sleep. I checked all the doors and windows, but they were all locked. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that whoever or whatever had been in my room had vanished without a trace. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting on the couch with all the lights on. The experience left me shaken, and I still don't have an explanation for what happened. I moved to a new apartment soon after, hoping to leave the memory behind, but sometimes late at night, I still feel like someone is watching me, and I can't help but wonder if the figure in the white sheet will ever return. I was working the graveyard shift at the gas station. The night was quiet, and I was halfway through my shift. The store was empty except for the hum of the refrigerators and the soft buzz of the overhead lights. I was stocking some shelves when I heard the chime of the door. A woman entered, holding a young boy's hand. They both looked scared. The woman's clothes were torn, and her face was streaked with tears. The boy clung to her side, his eyes wide with fear. She approached the counter, her voice shaky. "Can I use your phone?" I nodded and handed her the store phone. As she dialed, I noticed her hands trembling. The boy stayed close to her, looking around nervously. Couldn't imagine what they had been through. The woman spoke softly into the phone, her words rushed and urgent. I tried not to eavesdrop, but couldn't help catching fragments of her conversation. She was trying to reach someone for help. After the call, she asked if they could stay in the store for a while. I could see she was desperate. "Bourse," I said. "You can stay as long as you need." I offered them some free drinks and snacks. The woman's face softened a bit, and she thanked me. They sat in a corner, the boy munching on a candy bar while the woman sipped a bottle of water. I kept an eye on them, making sure they felt safe. The night dragged on, and the unease in my stomach grew. I didn't know what had happened to them, but it was clear they were running from something or someone. An hour passed. Door chimed again, this time more aggressively. A man stormed in, his face twisted with anger. "There you are," he shouted, making a beeline for the woman and the boy. The woman shrank back, pulling the boy closer. "Sir, you need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I stepped between him and the woman. "Get out of my way," he roared. "She's coming with me." He tried to push past me, but I held my ground. The woman was crying now, clutching her son protectively. "Sir, I'm calling the police," I warned. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the phone. The man's eyes flashed with rage, and he lunged at me, knocking the phone out of my hand. It clattered to the floor, but I managed to grab it and dial 911. "Help! We need police at the gas station on Elm Street," I shouted into the phone. The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity before I heard the sirens. The man continued to shout, trying to drag the woman out of the store. I stood in his way, hoping to buy time. The boy was crying now, his face buried in his mother's side. Finally, the police arrived. 2 officers burst through the door, guns drawn. "Step away from them," one officer commanded. The man hesitated, then raised his hands, his face still contorted with anger. The officers moved quickly, handcuffing him and escorting him out to the squad car. The woman collapsed onto a chair, sobbing with relief. The boy held on to her, still frightened, but visibly relieved that the man was gone. One of the officers stayed behind to talk to the woman. She explained that the man was her boyfriend and had been abusive. She had finally managed to escape with her son, seeking refuge in the gas station. The officer assured her that she was safe now, and that they would help her find a place to stay. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The situation had been terrifying, but I was glad I could help. The woman thanked me repeatedly, tears of gratitude in her eyes. I told her it was no problem, just glad she and her son were safe. Police took the man away, and the officer stayed with the woman until a social worker arrived. They arranged for her and her son to stay at a safe house for the night. As they left, the woman turned to me one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. I nodded, watching as they walked out into the night, finally safe from harm. The store was quiet again. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerators and the buzz of the lights. The night felt different now. I had faced something terrifying and helped someone in need. The graveyard shift had never felt so important as the hours passed and the morning light began to filter through the windows. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her son. I hoped they would find peace and safety in their new life, and I hoped that in some small way, I had made a difference. The memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder of the strength it takes to stand up to fear and the power of kindness in the face of darkness. When I was young, I had a passion for exploring abandoned places. The mystery of old, empty buildings always called to me. The idea that these places once buzzed with life but now stood silent fascinated me. I loved the thrill of stepping into the past, seeing the decay of what was once new, and feeling the history that lingered in the air. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned school in our town. The building had been empty for years, and many stories surrounded it. People said it was haunted, and we wanted to see for ourselves if it was true. It was a night perfect for our adventure. We met up at my house and packed flashlights, snacks, and our phones. There were 4 of us: me, Tom, Lisa, and Sarah. We were all excited and a little scared as we walked to the school. We talked about the stories we had heard. Some people said they heard strange noises inside. Others claimed to see shadows moving in the windows at night. When we reached the school, it looked even creepier than we imagined. The windows were broken, and the doors were boarded up. Vines had grown over the walls, and the paint was peeling off. The place looked like it belonged in a horror movie. We found a way in through a broken window at the back of the building. One by one, we climbed through, trying to be as quiet as possible. Once inside, we turned on our flashlights. The beams cut through the darkness, revealing dusty hallways and old lockers. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. We decided to stick together, not wanting to get lost in the maze of corridors. As we walked, our footsteps echoed loudly. Every sound seemed amplified in the empty building. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive. We started in the main hallway where the principal's office was. The door was ajar, and we pushed it open slowly. Inside, the room was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, and the desk was overturned. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I shivered, thinking about what could have caused such chaos. Next, we moved to the classrooms. Each one was filled with old desks and chairs, some broken and others covered in dust. Books were left open on the desks, their pages yellowed with age. It felt like the students had just left and never returned. In one classroom, we found a chalkboard with strange writing on it. The words were smeared and hard to read, but it looked like some kind of warning. Tom, always the brave one, laughed it off and said it was probably just kids playing a prank, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave me. As we continued exploring, we heard a loud bang from somewhere in the building. We all froze, our hearts pounding. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. We nodded, our eyes wide with fear. We decided to investigate, even though every instinct told me to leave. We followed the sound down a long, dark hallway. The walls were lined with old photos of students and teachers, their faces smiling and happy. It felt eerie, like they were watching us. At the end of the hallway, we reached the gymnasium. The doors were closed, but we could hear strange noises coming from inside. With a deep breath, Tom pushed the doors open. The gym was huge, and our flashlights barely lit up the far corners. We stepped inside, floor creaking beneath our feet. In the middle of the gym, we saw something that made our blood run cold. A figure stood there, dressed in old, tattered clothes. It was facing away from us, but we could see its shoulders rising and falling, as if it were breathing heavily. We stood frozen, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the figure turned around, and we saw its face. It was pale and gaunt, with dark, sunken eyes. It looked right at us and let out a chilling scream. We ran. I don't remember how we got out of the gym or the building. All I remember is the pure terror drove us to flee. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the school, panting and out of breath. We never went back to that school. The experience haunted us for a long time. We couldn't explain what we saw that night, and we didn't want to try. Our passion for exploring abandoned places was gone, replaced by the fear of what we might find. That night taught us that some places are better left alone. The abandoned school still stands, silent reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the dark, and I, for one, am happy to leave it that.